Hi class, and welcome to this recorded class lecture on part 2 of chapter 13. This weekend is the end of our module 2, so just take a look at my most recent announcement that I posted to make sure you're getting all of your assignments in. Your lab exam will open on Friday, and you'll have the weekend to do that, and then we'll take our lecture exam together all at the same time on Tuesday night via Proctorio. So this is part 2 of the peripheral nervous system. And there won't be too many questions from part 2, and I'll try to focus your studying on things that I want you to know. We're going to talk about the ear and then talk a little bit about cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and reflexes, but in kind of a brief overview. So I really kind of took out a lot of slides. I think there were over 200, so thank you for bearing with me as I'm working through simplifying my slides. And there's only about 60 to get through now, which we'll get through in a little bit shorter time. So in terms of our hearing and balance, the hearing apparatus allows us to hear an extraordinary range of sound. And we also have equilibrium or balance receptors within the inner ear that continually inform the nervous system of movement and position of the body in space. And we divide the ear into an external, a middle, and internal ear. External ear is just for hearing, middle ear is for hearing, but the inner ear is where hearing and equilibrium will occur. And we'll focus kind of where that's happening. The receptors for hearing and balance will respond to separate stimuli and are activated independently. So receptors for hearing are in your cochlea of the inner ear, and receptors for balance are in another part of the inner ear. So here's the external ear. It's made of the auricle and the external acoustic meatus. The tympanic membrane is the eardrum, and this will be the membrane or the boundary between the external and the middle ear. And the tympanic membrane will vibrate in response to sound waves when it hits it, and it will transfer those sound waves as energy to the bones of the middle ear. So hopefully this looks a little familiar from anatomy, the external ear with the external acoustic meatus and the auricle. The middle ear is air-filled with these tiny little ossicles, and the pharyngotympanic or eustachian tube or auditory tube that leads into the nasopharynx. It helps you to equalize pressure when you go up to high altitudes. And then the internal ear, or the labyrinth it's called because it's filled with fluid, that's where we have receptors for hearing and balance in 2 separate locations, and they work independently from each other. So the middle ear is the tympanic membrane. It's lined with mucosa. It's flanked laterally by a wall by the eardrum on one side and medially by a bony wall containing the oval or round membranous windows, which we'll talk about. So here's a look at the middle ear, and we can see these tiny ossicles, the malleus, incus, and stapes. They will vibrate in response to the sound waves that are passing through the tympanic membrane. And because they're so small, they can amplify those sound waves tremendously. And what they do is the stapes kind of is like a stirrup, and it will kind of bounce up against what we call the oval window, which is right below the stapes. It's kind of a membrane that will lead into the vestibule and cochlea. So the vibrations that are traveling through these auditory ossicles will eventually make their way by the pounding of the stapes against the oval window. It'll change those vibrations from the bones into waves that travel through endolymph or fluid in the inner ear. And again, the auditory tube empties out into the nasopharynx, the throat area behind your nasal cavity. And the popping sound of your ears is actually the popping of your tympanic membrane back into place when you go up to high altitudes. In the inner ear, you can see the cochlear nerve and the vestibular nerve going to the vestibule, the cochlear nerve going to the cochlea, where the receptors for hearing are located. The cochlear nerve and vestibular nerve branches both branch off of a common cranial nerve called the vestibulocochlear nerve. So here's the middle ear, describing a little bit about the auditory tube, also known as the eustachian tube. And then the middle ear, this describes the different auditory ossicles that I talked about. I don't know if I mentioned yet, but they're as tiny that they can all fit on the head of a penny. So that's how tiny they are. And then you have 2 types of muscles that will contract reflexively in response to loud sounds to prevent too much damage to hearing receptors. So the internal ear is also referred to as a labyrinth or a maze, and it's located in your temporal bone right behind your eye socket The bony labyrinth is the system of channels and cavities that worm through the bone. And this is what we divide into the vestibule, semicircular canals, and cochlea that are all filled with perilymph fluid, which is similar to cerebral spinal fluid. And the membranous labyrinth is a series of membranous sacs and ducts contained within the bony labyrinth that's filled with endolymph. So here's just a look at the semicircular canals. You have 3 of them, depending on their location. And then you have a utricle and a saccule in the vestibule that help with equilibrium and balance, along with the semicircular canals. We won't cover really what goes on in the semicircular canals in the vestibule that work with balance and equilibrium, but we're going to focus on the cochlea and how hearing occurs and where the receptors for hearing are located within that cochlea. I will tell you generally what happens in the vestibule. So it contains 2 membranous sacs called the saccule and utricle. Each houses equilibrium receptor regions that respond to gravity and changes in the position of your head. So if you look down, look back up right away, you have receptors in this region to help your body kind of maintain itself in normal function while your head is moving. The semicircular canals are 3 canals oriented in 3 planes of space, and they have receptors that respond to angular or rotational movements of the head. So think about a figure skater doing 10 spins in a row really quickly. These semicircular canals are responding to that angular rotational movement of the head. So again, here is the membranous labyrinth of the internal ear or the inner ear and the different structures. But we'll focus on the cochlea. It's a small spiral conical bony chamber. It's the size of a split pea. It looks like a snail shell. It coils around a bony pillar, and it contains the cochlear duct, which houses the spiral organ or the organ of Corti, and it ends at the cochlear apex. The cochlear duct and osseous spiral lamina together divide the cavity of the bony cochlea into these 3 chambers, which I will show you here. So in order to look at what these 3 chambers are, it's nice to imagine this if we unroll the cochlea completely and then just take a slice through one of the rolls and we look at these different chambers. We have the scala vestibule on the top, the cochlear duct in the middle, and the scala tympani in the bottom. And what is kind of zoomed in or with this rectangle around it is the spiral organ, where the hearing cells will be located. They'll be embedded in this tectorial membrane, and there will be spiral ganglion and neurons from that spiral ganglion that are reaching into those hair cells. And when those hair cells bend in response to movement through the endolymph, that is what is picked up by these neurons that will travel up to the brain so that your brain can interpret what you are hearing. So here we have the cochlea, a little more description of the cochlea. The big thing about the cochlea that you need to know is that the cochlea contains the receptors for hearing, and it contains those receptors in the spiral organ, which contains cochlear hair cells, with 1 row of inner hair cells and 3 rows of outer hair cells. And then you have the cochlear branch of cranial nerve number 8, which is the vestibular cochlear nerve, which runs from that spiral organ to the brain. So here we are, we're looking at the anatomy of the cochlea, but we're zoomed in on the organ of Corti, the spiral organ. This is exactly where the receptors for hearing are located. We have outer and inner hair cells, and they will bend in response to the endolymph waves passing through it. And remember that those waves passing through this endolymph are caused by those tiny little ossicles kind of pounding against that membranous oval window. So that pounding of vibrations will eventually get transmitted into waves that pass through the fluid-filled cochlea. Those waves will then cause these hair cells to bend, and the bending of the hair cells is picked up by fibers of the cochlear nerve to travel out of the ear into the brain, and that is how your brain can figure out what you're hearing. Again, it's always nice to look at a real picture instead of just an artist's rendition. So here we have outer and inner hair cells of the cochlea. And here's just a summary of the internal ear that gives you the bony labyrinth, the membranous labyrinth, and then the function, and then the receptor region. And again, you guys need to really know is that the hearing occurs, or receptors for hearing will be located in the cochlea. So this just takes you through the transmission and pathway of sound. So sound waves enter the external acoustic meatus. They strike the tympanic membrane, causing it to vibrate. The higher the intensity, the more vibration. The auditory ossicles will transfer the vibration of the eardrum to the oval window. The tympanic membrane is about 20 times larger than the oval window, so vibration is transferred to the oval window. It'll be amplified about 20 times. And then the transmission through the ear follows this pathway through the scala vestibule and through other pathways that we didn't quite touch on, but it eventually, you can see here how these waves travel through the cochlea. And this is showing you a cochlea that's unwound. You can see here at 4B, sounds in the hearing range go through the cochlear duct, vibrating and deflecting the hairs on the inner hair cells. And then these waves eventually travel all the way through the cochlear duct, and they kind of end at the round window. So it's another kind of membranous window where these vibrations will go through and kind of end, so that your cochlea doesn't constantly have waves of vibrations traveling through it. Here's the excitation of those inner hair cells. Again, they will bend at their base. The tip links, when pulled upon, will open ion channels. And again, whenever we open an ion channel, we will start an action potential when ions rush through. The longest hairs are enmeshed in the gel-like tectorial membrane that you can see there. And again, the bending of those hair cells embedded in the membrane will cause the action potential and the opening of ion channels. Then we'll briefly go through the structure and classification of your cranial nerves and your spinal nerves. A nerve itself is a cord-like organ of your peripheral nervous system. It's a bundle of myelinated and non-myelinated peripheral axons that are enclosed by connective tissue. And you can have spinal or cranial nerves depending on where they originate. These are the connective tissue coverings that go over the nerve. Has a similar kind of organization and setup to your muscle tissue and muscle fibers. And you can see a real look at a nerve here, and then another look here. You can see how the epinurium covers the outermost layer of the nerve, and then we divide the bundles into fascicles, which are covered by perinuriums, and then the fascicles are bundles of axons, and each axon is covered by an endoneurium. So nerves can be classified according to the direction they transmit impulses, as I think we kind of understand already. Mixed nerves contain both sensory and motor fibers, and their impulses will travel both to and from the brain. Sensory afferent nerves are impulses only towards the brain, and motor efferent nerves are impulses only away from the brain and spinal cord. Pure sensory afferent or pure motor efferent nerves are rare, and most nerves are mixed. Types of fibers in mixed nerves, for example, a somatic afferent are sensory neurons from the muscle to the brain. Somatic efferent are motor from the brain to the muscle. Visceral afferent are sensory neurons from organs to brain, and visceral efferent are motor neurons from brain to organs. Whenever you see the word ganglia, ganglia contain neuron cell bodies associated with nerves in the peripheral nervous system. We talked a little bit about dorsal root ganglia in the last chapter, and we'll talk about autonomic ganglia in chapter 14. So here are the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 2 attached to the forebrain, but the rest come out of the brainstem. Most are mixed nerves, but 2 are primarily sensory. And this kind of takes us through the 12 cranial nerves. You might have 1 or 2 questions about cranial nerves and what their functions are. But the functions are pretty easy to remember because you have an olfactory nerve that helps with the sense of smell. You can see that here. Optic nerves help with hearing. They'll be attached to the back of the eye as shown here, and they're across each other at the optic chiasm. Oculomotor nerves are chiefly motor nerves that contain a few proprioceptive afferents, and each nerve kind of includes the following that you can read through, but oculomotor nerves specifically will give motor fibers to some of the eye muscles. The trochlear nerves also give motor innervation to one of the extrinsic eye muscles, the superior oblique muscle. Trigeminal nerves, we say it's tri because there's 3 divisions of it: the ophthalmic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division. And each division kind of tells you where this branch goes to. So this is the trigeminal nerve. It's the largest cranial nerve. It's a main general sensory nerve of the face. It emits afferent impulses from touch, temperature, and pain receptors. But the mandibular division does contain some motor fibers that innervate chewing muscles. So you can see here the trigeminal nerves and the different regions of the face where they're going. The abducens nerve is primarily motor, giving motor supply to the lateral rectus muscle. So many of the cranial nerves control the eye muscles. The facial nerve courses to the lateral aspect of the face. It's a chief motor nerve of the face with a temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical branch. And it has several different, it works to kind of control some of the facial expressions of the muscle. You can see all the branches of the facial nerve and where they go to many different spots on the face. The vestibular cochlear nerve goes to the ear to help with hearing. The vestibular nerve goes to the vestibule, and the cochlear nerve goes to the cochlea. The glossopharyngeal nerve leaves the skull via the jugular foramen to run to the throat. Glosso has to do with tongue, and salivary glands. So this will help to innervate some of the muscles associated with swallowing and producing saliva. The vagus nerve is the only cranial nerve that actually leaves the head and neck region to go into the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. And it has mixed nerves of motor and sensory nerves going to many different of the organs. Accessory nerve innervates the trapezius muscle, and the accessory nerve is kind of uniquely looked because it has several branches coming off of the lower or the upper spinal cord. Hypoglossal nerve, it travels to the tongue to help with motor innervation of the tongue. You can see those cranial nerves coming out there. And then we have spinal nerves. You have 31 pairs. They supply all parts of the body except the head and part of the neck. And they're all mostly mixed, and they're named for the point of tissue or issue from the spinal cord. You have 7 cervical vertebrae give rise to 8 pairs of cervical nerves. The last spinal nerve, C8, will exit the canal inferior to vertebra, C7. So each of the other spinal nerves will exit inferior to the vertebra for which it is named. So here we have the vertebra and the spinal nerves coming off of the vertebra right below the vertebra for which it's named. We talked a little bit about the spinal cord, how it has a ventral and dorsal root. The ventral root contains all motor fibers, and the dorsal root contains all sensory fibers from sensory neurons in the dorsal root ganglion. And then both ventral and dorsal roots will be branched medially as rootlets and then join laterally to form a spinal nerve. So you can see that here. The dorsal root contains all sensory information. The ventral root contains all motor information, and then they'll join to form kind of one spinal nerve. And then we'll end a little bit talking about reflex activity. We've gone over reflexes already, but you will have 1 or 2 questions about reflexes. Again, reflexes, arcs will enable a response, and you can have an inborn intrinsic reflex, which is rapid, involuntary, predictable motor response to a stimulus, like maintaining your posture or controlling your visceral activities. And it can be modified by learning and conscious effort. And a learned or acquired reflex results from the practice of repetition, like driving skills. And you should know these basic components of a reflex arc. The receptor is the site of the stimulus action. The sensory neuron transmits afferent impulses to your central nervous system. You have an integration center, which will be either monosynaptic or polysynaptic. And then the motor neuron will conduct efferent impulses from the integration center to the effector organ, where the effector is the muscle fiber or gland cell that responds to the efferent impulses by contracting or secreting. Reflexes can be somatic, which will activate skeletal muscle, or they can be autonomic or visceral reflexes that activate visceral effectors, like smooth or cardiac muscle or glands. And these are just the 5 basic components of the reflex arc. And we'll end here for chapter 13. Chapter 14 will go over the autonomic nervous system, and we'll spend some time with that on Thursday as we wrap up module 2. So thanks for listening, guys, and I hope you are all doing well.